So thank you all for joining me today. I'm excited to be here, and we will be talking about predicting performance and employee retention. What I'm bringing to you today is really a perspective of what are some of the common challenges and some of the common best practices around how you can make performance improvement initiatives, how you can make employee retention stick. And so I hope that by the end of this conversation, and I do hope that there will be dialogue at the end, and in between maybe if you ask questions, that you'll walk away with some fresh perspective of how you can look at performance improvement opportunities and also employee retention opportunities in your organization. So one thing that is underlying both performance as well as employee retention is the employee experience. And when I talk about employee experience, what I'm really referring to is every single touch point or interaction that someone, an employee at your organization has from the moment that they maybe apply for a job to the moment that they leave your organization. I'm going to focus on the employee experience as it relates to people executing the role that they were hired for. Now, when we look at employee experiences, we can ask the question, what drives those experiences? What creates positive experiences and what creates negative experiences? And I would argue that the number one factor driving those experiences is your culture, your organizational culture. There are different definitions of what culture is, but what I really want to highlight today are 4 areas that we've seen that are very, very much impactful and possibly also distractors from the ability to retain talent and perform well. So let's start with organizational factors. Organizational factors are really the foundation for making any organization function. They are your strategic priorities, your processes, your resources, your technology, your systems. These are the things that make sure that anything is working at all. And whether or not someone has a positive experience at work is highly correlated with whether they have the right organizational factors in place to do so. The second category I want to talk about is the customer or peer interactions. And what that's really referring to is, in today's world, most people, most employees, live in a matrixed environment. They have different stakeholders internally or externally to the organization that they need to collaborate with and that they need to have the right kinds of interactions with. And whether or not an employee says they have a good experience is also correlated with how well those handoffs are working, how well those collaborations are working, and the relationships that are being built. The third category that shapes employee experience is the business disruptions. Business disruptions are things like COVID happening. Business disruptions are things like you rolling out digital transformation efforts, or you acquiring another company and merging, or maybe you're laying off employees because you need a leaner workforce. All of those things disrupt the ways of working as they have appeared today. And so an employee's experience is heavily correlated with how well you're able to handle those disruptions. And then last but not least, we have the leadership factors. And the leadership factors refer to anything that any leader in your organization says or does to allow an employee to be successful in their role. So all of those factors have a massive impact on whether an employee says they have a positive experience at work or not. At the end of the day, when we talk about experience, that sounds kind of vague. What exactly do we mean by that? And when we ask employees why they stay or why they leave an organization, they typically say there are 2 things that are most important to them. The first thing is people will say, I'm leaving because I was not able to do my work well. I want to be successful, I want to be effective, and the environment that I'm in is not allowing me to do that. So I am not supported in my ways of working, so I'm out. The other piece that people may say is, I am not engaged, which translates into, I'm not sure what the why is of where we're heading and why this is important. I don't know what my role is within that. And I also don't know how I'm contributing to this. And so that's the second most common reason that is shaped by those different cultural factors of why people are leaving. So at the end of the day, companies that are really good at driving performance consistently and retaining employees, they know that everything they do needs to support people in being successful in their roles and giving them a reason to be connected to the company over time. So many organizations we work with do attempt to roll out programs to shape the employee experience. And there are different ways to go about it, and I want to highlight two today that I have seen being used by our clients, and they are kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. So the first one that I want to talk about, let's call it Company A. In Company A, the focus is really HR has an initiative. HR is tasked with making sure that people don't leave. HR is tasked with making sure people have what they need to work effectively. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it tends to mean is that the focus is on, let's do surveys. Let's collect data that way to find out where we need to focus. And it's usually a short-term focus that is geared more towards, can we get the survey scores to change, than actually saying, what are the things we need to change so that people can be better at doing what we ask them to do so we get better business impact, and them to actually see that, experience that, and care. And so in that scenario, leadership is typically engaged in some ways. So leadership may show up for certain events that you're holding. So for example, in this particular case, HR may find that stress and burnout are a big topic. And so they say, okay, we're going to launch a series of mindfulness practice sessions that people can join. Or we might make a life coach available to certain individuals. Or whatever it is that seems to be something that could address, in the short term, what employees are really needing support around. The problem with that is it's usually a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not long-lasting. It doesn't address the fact that there's usually a cultural issue that permeates the entire organization that's at the root cause of some of the bad feedback that you might be getting around employee experiences. So let me give you an example of one of my clients that started this way. So in their case, one of the challenges they ran into is people were quitting, performance was starting to dip, but all the data they were collecting said everybody's happy. There's nothing wrong. One of the things that they ran into is that over time, fewer and fewer people were actually completing their surveys or participating in focus groups. And so what you end up with is incomplete data. The people that are most likely dissatisfied with the support they're getting are probably not completing the surveys to begin with. Now, the other thing that happened in this particular company was, again, this is an HR-driven approach. So whenever a team dared to speak up and say, we cannot do the work that you're asking us to do and we don't understand what all the changes that are going on, and we need help, and here's the help we need, HR would go in and essentially try to fix that team. As you can imagine, what that led to over time is the leader of that team saying, don't you dare writing anything in that report because they're just gonna show up and make us do stuff. And it doesn't look good because nobody else in the organization is actually speaking up about the same challenges. So we look like the only ones that are not doing well. So again, culturally, what ended up happening was that people were really unhappy, didn't know where to go, didn't have a way to actually improve on anything. And so they quit. So while the company was well-intentioned in trying to influence people's ability to perform and to retain employees, they were not effective. Now, another way to approach it, and this is really on the opposite end of the spectrum, is by saying, you know what, employee experience is really about daily interactions that I as an employee have with the people around me. And so the best person to own that and have a responsibility for continuous improvement conversations, for instance, is the people leader, is that direct person, that person's direct supervisor. And so in this example, when a company is rolling out this employee experience thing, it is not an initiative, it's simply a priority. It's a priority owned by leaders. There's alignment at the leadership level about what does good leadership support even look like? And how does it look in alignment with our values? So for example, is there something about us having to be trusted coaches to the people that we work with, because that's one of our values, to create these trusting relationships? And what does that look like when we actually work with specific teams and solve specific problems? So in this case, what we have is companies that are very much focused on changing the culture in a way that is consistent across leadership levels with the goal of shaping the employee experience and shaping the way that people are able to do their job with HR support, but in actual execution, personalized to whatever team you're working with the knowledge that every team, every individual is going to have unique challenges that need to be addressed quickly by that direct leader. And any kind of data around shaping employee experience, shaping ways of working, is combined with other data around productivity and any other metrics that you might be tracking when leaders at different levels review progress. So you're making the metrics associated with employee experience programs part of the regular conversations about how we as a company are doing, and hold everybody accountable at every level to take action to close gaps. So I've given you two examples of what companies can do to start shaping the employee experience, and I'm just curious, with a show of hands, where does your organization fall? So who in this room feels that employee experience has been addressed more in the version of Company A thus far? Okay, thank you for being honest. And who feels like they're more leaning towards Company B? Okay, and everybody who didn't raise their hand is not sure that anything is happening to drive employee experience, I guess. Okay, so one of the key aspects of driving employee experience that I've brought up in a couple of different ways today is the role of people leaders. People leaders are really at the center of creating the support for people being successful in their roles and for employee retention. And they do that in two ways. We know there's ample research out there, and in fact there was even a Harvard Business Review study again a couple of weeks ago. We know that the likelihood of you staying is very strongly correlated with not just the relationship you have with your direct supervisor, but the conversations you have with your direct supervisor. Not only that, we talked about the organizational factors, we talked about disruptions, we talked about the stakeholder engagements, and it's your direct supervisor that is in the best position to make sure that you have all that organizational support you need, or ways to operate under conditions that you're in that may be limited. It's your people leader who's in the position to actually ensure that handoffs with other departments or decisions that need to be made collaboratively, et cetera, are all actually happening the way they should. And it's also your direct supervisor who plays a big role in whether or not you're going to be successfully adapting to new ways of working as a result of business disruptions. And that's why in this conversation today, that's why the title talked about the importance of intentional leadership, and that's why we want to now talk about what are some of the things that leaders can actually do that will make their support really focused and really impactful in a short period of time. So, for people, leaders, to do well, one thing that can really help them is to understand the science of behavior. What's the science of behavior? Well, it's the study of why we do what we do, or why we don't. And it's really all about understanding how can we create an environment that makes it more likely that people do the things that we need them to do, or do more of the things that make them feel engaged. And so if leaders understand some of those principles of the science of behavior, then they can very systematically and intentionally shape those employee experiences that we've been talking about. So let's talk about what I mean by the science of behavior and some of those principles. Well, one of the first things is when we typically talk about our goals, especially in manufacturing, what we typically talk about is what are we trying to achieve ultimately? What are our lagging KPIs? Where are we heading? For example, what kind of revenue do we want to make? We want everybody to go home safely. We also ask the question of, well, what are the leading indicators that are telling us that we're heading in the right direction on meeting those lagging indicators? Organizations that leverage some of the principles from the science of behavior say, well, that's good, but here's the problem. We have a lot of disruptions, we have a lot of change going on at any given point in time. And we need to respond quickly to changing demands. We need to be able to quickly align our workforce with new expectations around operational excellence, with new expectations around any of the changes that we're going through. And so we need an early indicator. We can't rely on our traditional leading indicators. We need to ask the question if, for example, we are trying to substantially increase safety performance in our organization. We need to ask the question, what is going to be most difficult about doing that? Who are the people that are at the forefront of driving safety? So for example, our operators. What are they doing every day? So let's say one of the leading indicators that we're looking at is completing safety tags or stop audits or having the right kinds of team conversations about safety data. Companies that understand the science of behavior then ask the question, okay, so what kinds of things our operators need to do consistently to drive those leading indicators? And what is going to be difficult for them to do? So, for example, you may find that you have some operators that just don't go on their daily rounds. They don't go and actually proactively look for improvement opportunities in and around the equipment. And no matter how many times you tell them they need to complete safety tags, the main problem is they're not doing those rounds. And there may be a lot of different reasons for why that's happening. But companies that understand that behaviors are the leading indicators, that are the earliest indicators, whether or not you're going to meet safety targets, are going to ask the question, okay, so where's the bottleneck? Which behaviors are not happening and why? Are there any quick fixes? So can we just do a training? Can we do a process fix? Do we just need to translate one of our instruction manuals into a different language? And if it's still unlikely that the behavior occurs, they then say, okay, we do not have the luxury to hold off and wait whether our safety performance improves. We need to go in, and this is just one example, this holds true for any of our major priorities in the organization. we then go in and say, we need to make sure that the frontline supervisors or the line leads or whoever is supervising those individuals knows exactly how to look for those particular behaviors that are hard and coach towards them and support them in the right way. And one of the things that happens quite often is that we underestimate the power of people not engaging in those seemingly simple behaviors because we're very focused on process and technology. And the other thing we often overlook is that frontline supervisors may not actually follow up in the right way. So they may restate the expectations. They may do everything to set the person up, but they are not following up on the back end to make sure that, again, the behavior is happening, the leading indicators are being impacted in a positive way over time, or changing course if they're not. And so again, what companies that do this really well do is they make sure that frontline supervisors know at any given point in time what's the most critical behavior for me to focus on in my operators, line leads, or whoever is reporting into me. The other thing that's really important, so we've just talked about the workforce that is closest to performing the work or impacting the metrics. And we've talked about what supervisors can do to ensure that those critical behaviors are happening. But very often that's where we stop and we miss the opportunity to say, all right, if we're all aligned that at the end of the day we want our frontline people to be effective in the work they do so that our leading and lagging indicators move in the right direction, our entire organization needs to be aligned. So we can't stop at the frontline supervisors. We also need to say, okay, what are the managers doing to support the frontline supervisors? And what are the executives doing to support the managers? And this may all sound very simplistic, but think about it. How many times do you start the other way around and you say, there are certain competencies that our leaders need, and we're going to roll them out because research tells us these are the right competencies. And if we do this well, people will be able to successfully do their job and feel engaged. But the problem is you're just generally pushing expectations down into the organization without an aim. So if one of the competencies is around setting clear expectations, for instance, then what are you setting expectations for? How do frontline leaders know what's really going to make a difference at the end of the day in your business performance? How do they know, with the little time they have and the many different things that are going on at any given point in time, where it matters the most? Yes, you want competencies to show up consistently, but when you start at the top, then you're just pushing principles down. When you start at the bottom, you're solving a problem. So companies that do this really well map out, they look for the next 6 to 9 months, they map out what are the priorities that are going to be hard for the people doing the work. And will they be able to do this on their own, or do we have to have this alignment up the chain and enable our frontline supervisors to support them so that we can accelerate the transition rather than fall down in the process of waiting until something goes wrong? So start with the end in mind, and once you've clearly identified what everybody needs to do, you can roll it out, starting with holding your executives accountable. Now you might say to me, okay, so what are some of those consistent things that leaders can do? Frontline leaders, for instance, what are some things that the science of behavior tells us are most correlated with people being able to do their job well? And luckily, there's enough research out there that we know what those minimum behaviors should look like. Here's the first one: delivering clear expectations. Delivering clear expectations in this case includes, why are we doing this? Why is it important? What are we trying to do here? What is the expectations and how are we going to get there? It means engaging people in that process of setting the final expectations. So a leader who does this really well gives people a choice and a voice in all of this and includes the why in how they're communicating. Secondly, we've got removing barriers. Removing barriers in this case is all about making people's jobs easier. and at the end of the day, alleviating stress and burnout. So removing barriers is not just about making sure someone meets their production targets. The next one is watching and listening, whether you are with your workforce on the shop floor or whether you're in a hybrid environment, whatever your environment is. Watch and listen. You need to know as a leader what people do. You need to understand what the best practices are and continuously look for opportunities to help. You can only do that if you watch and listen. Providing feedback. Feedback that is growth focused, that is future focused. So I'm trying to increase the likelihood that someone changes the way they work going forward, not berate them about what happened in the past. I also want to make sure that I'm balancing positive feedback over constructive feedback. Again, if it's growth focused, you're trying to shape someone towards doing more of something, which you can't do if you simply provide negative or constructive feedback. And then finally, be a trusted coach. And that really just means do what you say. Do what you say is a really important thing. And then secondly, pay attention to the things that people do really well and continue to coach them towards the things where they need support. Now, I've given you a couple of practices that are really important across an entire organization. And so if one team in your plant, for instance, uses this process, uses the mapping that I was talking about earlier, these behaviors, that's good, but it's only effective if the entire company, if the entire plant, if the entire organization, if there is alignment in that all people leaders are doing these things consistently and are shaping it towards the specific problem you're trying to solve. So that's why I'm going to leave you with something to think about, a reflection opportunity. Think about the companies that you're part of, and think about, if I look at the majority of leaders, are they doing these things consistently? Where do they fall on this scale? So the first step, as it relates to shaping employee experience, is unaware. And that's really when leaders say employee experience is a soft thing that's owned by HR. I don't have a lot of accountability. And we are going to collect most of our data through surveys, and I'm going to wait for HR to tell me to what extent I need to be engaged. The next level of leadership is when leaders begin to understand that the employee experience is actually important, both from an employee retention perspective, but also for business success. And this is when leaders may start to say, okay, tell me specifically what can I do in the initiatives that you're planning, in the solutions that you're planning to show that I'm committed. At the next level, this is when leaders start to own the employee experience. And that typically means they're consistently talking about it. They're consistently talking about, I want to support you in doing your job well and be successful. I want you to feel engaged and understand your role in helping us shape the vision. And a lot of that happens through communication. And there's also this moment where leaders realize, you know what, maybe I need some training to understand how I can best support my employees in this context. So that's often when you see training around shaping employee experience and engaging people. At the next level, this is what I talked about earlier, where there's a common definition of what good leadership looks like those 5 leadership practices that I just shared earlier. And leaders are saying that they know they are responsible for shaping the employee experience, and they're holding themselves accountable. There's continuous feedback loops with employees to make sure that leaders are showing up for them in the right way at the right time. And there are various metrics that are consistently being tracked to make sure that there is a positive continuous improvement loop on the employee experience. Also, finally, companies that do this really well, that master shaping the employee experience, what they do is they link that leadership to actual business performance. That's what I was talking about earlier. They start with the end in mind. What are we trying to get? What are our priorities? Where is it going to be hard? Where will our people need additional support in setting them up for success? And they apply their leadership, common leadership practices to those particular problems to accelerate the adoption of new practices and accelerate leading and lagging results impact. And senior leaders at the plant, at the site, at the organizational level, review data on how that's going. Everybody has data on how that's going, how leaders across the organization are performing, and the actual correlation between what's happening there, what performers are doing, and the leading and lagging results. And it's that combination and the continuous improvement efforts that then have the biggest impact. Okay. So understand what your organization is currently doing to shape the employee experience. Discuss what effective leadership should look like at your organization and hold everybody accountable to that. Determine what is needed by way of training or other mechanisms to get leaders ready. And then make sure that those leaders intentionally and consistently apply those practices that you are expecting from them in a way that drives positive business outcomes. And then gather feedback and continue to improve.